Today's guest is Mike Mutzel, who has a BS in biology. He has a background in clinical nutrition, for which he's pursuing a degree right now. He's been doing some training through the Institute of Functional Medicine. He also works for one of the largest nutrition supplement companies in the country, and has written a book, The Belly Fat Effect. And I'm excited to have him here because we're going to talk about some things about like leptin and some other stuff that I actually don't know a ton about. So I'm thrilled to have you here, Mike. Welcome to the Autoimmune Summit.
Thanks so much, Dr. Amy. So happy to be here.
Awesome. Well, let's get started with how did you get into nutrition and the supplement industry and writing a book about belly fat?
Yeah, great question, Amy. It came out from, I've been interested in nutrition my whole life. My family were really into nutrition and all that, although I did grow up kind of eating Pop-Tarts and, Taco Bell. And then we just made a switch when I was, starting to play sports in high school and studied biology as my undergrad. And then I wanted to go to med school, actually. Took the MCAT and then got an internship with an integrative doctor in Colorado and started doing clinical nutrition work with his overweight metabolic syndrome, more metabolically complex patients. And what I found out real quick is these individuals, seemed to eat like low calorie diets. So I knew there was something more going on. Why were they overweight, but eating cottage cheese and a Diet Coke and a muffin, but still very obese, and just dove into the research and found that, fat is so much more complex than we've been told. It's way more complex from, if we look at gut hormones and really how bariatric surgery works, and then look at the fat cell or the adipocyte itself and all the different cytokines and adipocytokines and hormones released from fat tissue. So that just got me down this puzzle to write the book and really want to spread this message because there's so much great research going on right now, and it's really not making it to the end user that's struggling with belly fat that doesn't seem to get, burned off, or cellulite, or, in the context of what we're talking about today, autoimmunity. So that's kind of the short and long version of how I got into it.
Oh, good. Well, let's talk about, before we get into autoimmunity, I'd love to just talk about fat. I have those patients myself and I never know what to do with them, right? They're following my program. They come in with these food diaries and I'm like, I'd be starving if that's all I ate. And then they're, 4 times as big as me. And it's not making sense. And I do all the thyroid markers. I check all the hormones and everything else is looking great. And I'm like, I honestly don't know how to explain this short of this not being the truth. Of course, I'm not accusing them, but I'm like, if this is honestly what you're doing, I'm puzzled. I'm stuck. So help me out.
I know. I was in that same boat. It's pretty funny. And I was like you. I was in disbelief. All right, are you sure you're not just closet eating and hitting the refrigerator at midnight and stuff like that? But here's what's really interesting. A lot of people think that they need to starve themselves and reduce their calories. But what happens when you do that, you actually shut down your gut hormones. So your gut releases 26 plus different hormones in response to you chewing, eating, sensing, smelling food. And what's really unique about that is that's what really tells insulin to be released, which of course insulin helps to balance blood sugar. That's going to suppress or increase appetite and so forth. And in a lot of people, when they undergo these low calorie diets, they actually shut down the production of these critical gut hormones. And when I say critical, they're really imperative. If you look at how bariatric surgery causes rapid weight loss and actually rapid restoration or reversal of type 2 diabetes within 12 hours after surgery, which a lot of people don't understand, how it's crazy. Full-blown insulin type 2 diabetics, 12 hours after surgery. Keep in mind, Dr. Amy, these subjects haven't eaten any meals, so it's not related to the foods that they're eating. But the bariatric surgery or gastric bypass changes the composition of the gut and changes the gut hormones. And as such, it helps to balance insulin resistance, helps to control appetite, and change inflammation. So that's how important it is. And as another aside, all the new diabetic drugs in the pipeline right now are going after the so-called incretin hormones. Januvia is one, Bayetta is another, but there's many compounds out there right now. So back to these, how do we, increase or decrease these different gut hormones? Studies have shown that when you embark on a low-calorie diet, less than 1,200, or one study was less than 1,200, another study looked at less than 1,600 calories, you shut down these gut hormones for up to 18 months.
Oh my gosh.
So these people that are doing these yo-yo diets, they're like trying to really reduce their calorie intake to burn fat. They're shutting down their gut hormones. And what is that doing? That's causing systemic insulin resistance. When you're insulin resistant, you can't burn fat. That's what a lot of people don't understand. And that's why it's so critical to have proper blood sugar regulation. And moreover, these gut hormones control appetite. So these people are, they might be fine during the middle part of the day, but when it comes to dinner, they're like ravaging, hungry and hit the calories, and it just creates this vicious cycle. So that's one thing that I think is a piece of the puzzle, back to your original question. And part two, I think, is low-grade inflammation. When you're inflamed, you're insulin resistant, and we can talk about why that is. And as we just said, when you're insulin resistant, you can't burn fat. So here you go, you have people eating these low-calorie diets. They might have dysbiosis or gut bacterial imbalances. They might have had early life experiences like cesarean section delivery, for example, lack of breastfeeding, exposure to proton pump inhibitors, NSAIDs, all these different compounds that would perturb the gut microbiome, which would actually enable their gut microbiome to extract more calories from the food that they eat. So that's another thing people don't think about, is when you're eating, you're not just eating for your body, you're eating for your microbiome, which, as many of the listeners know, is, outnumbering the number of human cells in our body 100 to 1, our DNA 150 times to 1. These gut bacteria, I should say, are very efficient in how they can extract calories from the food that we eat, release secondary compounds called short-chain fatty acids that promote adipogenesis or the formation of new fat cells, drive inflammation, and so forth. So we need to move beyond just, calories, and then talk about this, as you just said, weight loss resistance and strategies that we can implement and give people, practical tips to help them reverse the cycle.
So do we want to go down that route right now, or do we want to keep on the inflammation route?
Let's go down that route. Yeah. So the first thing that I think, and what I found clinically, is this weight loss resistance is really a low-grade inflammation going on. And what that is derived from is, as we talked about, the gut imbalances, the foods that people are eating, but also the changes in the fat cell itself. So when you were in medical school, Amy, you were taught that the fat cell is somewhat inert. We don't really know much about it. It's a storage depot. So as Jeff Bland says, it stores those extra calories for the rainy day that never comes. But we know that the fat cell actually releases what's called adipocytokines. Adiponectin, which is one, leptin is another, various pro-inflammatory signaling molecules, and these communicate with the rest of the body. And leptin, it turns out, actually drives inflammation. So the more fat tissue you have, the more leptin you release, and the more inflammation you're going to have. And again, inflammation is linked with insulin resistance. If you're inflamed, you just can't burn fat.
Mm-hmm. And so as a practitioner, are there labs that you recommend? I mean, I believe I actually had a patient come in with a leptin level the other day. So you can actually measure leptin, correct?
Exactly. That's a really cool thing. Now, most labs, commercial labs, Quest, LabCorp, even HDL Health Diagnostics, some of these more boutique labs do leptin testing. But the cool thing is you don't really actually have to test. The more fat tissue you have, Dr. Amy, the more leptin you're going to be releasing. So just kind of like the thyroid is the main gland that releases thyroid hormone, the fat cells are the main tissues in the body that release leptin. The more fat you have, the more leptin you're going to be releasing. So I think it's nice for some people if they need some sort of objective biomarker to make some sort of lifestyle change to get their leptin levels shifted. Or if they're having cellulite or just not getting the results that they want in the gym and have relatively low body fat percentage, then they might want to get their leptin levels tested. But if you're a man and your body fat percentage is above 20, or if you're a woman and your body fat percentage is above 25, you're going to have leptin levels in that, kind of that yellow red range where you don't want to, them to be. That's where the problems start, I should say. And this is really what leptin does. It's kind of like the fuel gauge on your car. So Dr. Amy, if you're driving down the road and your gas gauge says full, you're not going to go fuel up. But if it's on E, you're going to go fuel up. And so that's kind of what happens. And leptin oscillates in a diurnal rhythm like many hormones in the body. When we wake up in the morning and about 10 a.m. is 10 to 1 p.m. is about its lowest level. And that's like your fuel gauge being on empty. That's going to tell you to go refuel. And that's why so many people should be eating a large breakfast and a large lunch, because that will help to balance their leptin levels. Now then leptin will start, as we increase our fuel stores during the day, leptin will start to rise, and it will be at its, kind of peak about midnight. Okay. And that's designed to keep you asleep and stay asleep, But the problem is individuals have what's called leptin resistance. So they have so much fat tissue, so much leptin being released. It's, targeting the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus basically is saying no, we've received too many, of you guys. We're not going to listen to your message anymore. And you get this, what's called leptin resistant state. So the body's, even though it's on E or it's on full, the gas gauge, so to speak, the energy gauge is reading on empty. So people are chronically hungry and want to eat and refuel, even though they have enough storage on board. Here's why this is really problematic. Not only are you going to eat more calories than you should, but leptin stimulates the immune system to be more pro-inflammatory. So it activates these, T lymphocytes, for example. I'm sure we've heard about T helper type 1 cells, T helper type 17. These are all these pro-inflammatory immune cells that drive inflammatory processes, that drive autoimmunity. For example, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, lupus, cancer, psoriatic arthritis, whatever it is. They're linked with these, higher levels of pro-inflammatory T helper cells. So that's what leptin does. The other thing that it does is it downregulates the T regulatory cells, which is so critical to suppressing inflammation. I liken T reg cells to policemen, right? Policemen help to break up fights and riots and bad things. So the T reg cells, when it comes to asthma and allergies, autoimmunity, even reducing fat, T reg cells are our friend. They're thumbs up. But when you have elevated levels of leptin, you're going to have low levels of T reg cells. So what does that mean? The more belly fat you have, or body fat in general, the more leptin you're going to have, and the more inflammation you're going to have. And that's going to set you up for a predisposition to have more inflammatory, autoimmune, atopy, asthma, allergies, you name it. And, that can manifest as obesity or autoimmune diseases. So in addition to restoring the immune system, we also need to look at the metabolic system and incorporate, exercise and stress reduction techniques and sleep techniques to really keep the biological hormones, cortisol, insulin, leptin on check, and then also address the immune side with anti-inflammatory foods, phytochemicals, LDN, whatever it may be, because these are two pieces of the puzzle that really crosstalk and communicate.
And so does it matter, you're speaking about belly fat here, but does it matter, some people talk about what's called that apple shape, where it's more on the belly versus the pear shape, where it's more on the buttocks and hips. Does it matter? Is the fat on the belly worse or better than that on the buttocks? Or if you got fat and cellulite, it's bad news no matter what?
Yeah, well, I guess it depends if you're at the beach or not. No, I'm just kidding. It really, the regional differences in fat tissue is pretty remarkable. So the reason why I say belly fat is it's this white adipose tissue. And so when we talk about fat, it's really medically defined as adipose tissue. And if you look at adipose tissue under a microscope, for example, you bring up a really good point here, is particularly in the belly fat or the visceral adipose tissue, it's actually characterized by levels of immune cells. And that's why it's so problematic. So if you look at subcutaneous adipose tissue in the thighs, the buttocks, and so forth, or back of the arms, a lot of ladies tend to get fat there, and you look at that type of adipose tissue under the microscope, there's not as much immune cells and activity and cytokines being released. So it's not as metabolically disruptive to the metabolic system and to the immune system. But the reason why I focus on belly fat is if you were to biopsy or pinch your belly fat right now, everyone has a little bit, right? But what you're actually pinching, it's majority immune cells on a cellular basis, which people don't think about. So again, we're going back to that microscope of the adipocyte. You look at it on a volume basis. It's a lot of these lipid droplets. That's what fat is. It's stored as what's called lipid droplets. But in and around that, you see a lot of non-fat cells, and these are these immune cells. Macrophages are one, mast cells, B cells. Every immune cell that's say in, upregulated in autoimmunity, is also found in and around fat tissue. And that's why my hypothesis and what research shows is why it's so hard to burn fat if you have a lot of belly fat, because it's chronically inflamed. And again, inflammation is linked with insulin resistance. So the thing is when individuals gain more and more weight, the number and amount and quantity of immune cells in and around the fat tissue increases about 5-fold. And so you're increasing whole body inflammation the more weight you have. Now, as you mentioned, in the subcutaneous regions, like the glutes, the buttocks, the back of the arms, there's still immune cell infiltration, but it's not nearly as high as it is around the belly. So that's why a lot of men, for example, have a lot of heart disease and myocardial infarction, autoimmunity, and different things that's more fatal, for example, with increased BMI and so forth. So belly fat's bad news bears.
And what about that whole term that we're kind of seeing around about the skinny fat person? Is that, because I imagine what people are imagining in their mind as they're listening to you, somebody who's walking around who's, visibly overweight, and it's evident that they have some extra pounds and maybe fall into this category. But what about those people that term walking around now, the skinny fat? Can you, first talk about that and then...
Yeah, that's huge. I'm really glad you brought that up. So these skinny fat or metabolically obese normal weight individual, so this affects about 15 to 20% of the population. And actually it's higher in women, for example. So the situation with that is you get a lot of, in metabolically obese normal weight individuals, they have a lot of ectopic lipid deposition. And what that means is they're getting fatty deposition inside their tissues, the pancreas, the liver, inside the visceral omentum, which is kind of the big region right here in the GI tract area. And that's really problematic. So these individuals tend to have a higher level of inflammation going on and are at increased risk for various diseases, of which autoimmunity would be one. So that's a really good point. I'm so glad you talked about that, because like you said, people are probably thinking that we're just, picking on overweight, the visibly overweight, but we're really talking about everyone. So just because you don't look in the mirror and have a big beer belly doesn't mean you're safe, so to speak. Doesn't mean you can keep hitting the drive-through and the Big Macs and the McDonald's, because you could be having, damage to your organs, which is really going to affect your longevity and health throughout life.
And so how would somebody know? Is that simply doing a percentage body fat? Is that lab testing? Is that looking at metabolic markers? How does that person know? I mean, and can that person be somebody who's not going to McDonald's but is eating what they think is a healthy diet and just maybe not working out or something?
Yeah, really great point. Yeah, it can just be low muscle mass or sarcopenia, for example. And so the proportion to, body fat to muscle can be off, for example. And that's why I think you hit on a couple of things. Exercise is really so important. We can talk about the anti-inflammatory potential of exercise. So when you move your muscles, you actually release these things called myokines. And these are signaling molecules released from muscle tissue, and they're so anti-inflammatory. And so muscle tissue also releases or has leptin receptors, for example. So you can actually lower your leptin levels by just having more lean muscle tissue, which is a great thing. Now, how do people test for this? I think the best thing, as you hit on, is bioimpedance or body fat percentage, because that will look at the entire body. A lot of folks, when they go to our traditional medical setting, they're going to get body mass index, and that really doesn't, stratify for body fat percentage, which is what we're looking for here. But the other thing would be metabolic markers too. So I'd like to look at liver enzymes, and not just AST and ALT, but GGT. A lot of research shows that is linked with, histological changes within the liver, not only from environmental toxins, but the so-called ectopic or, fatty liver formation. So that's another one. Triglycerides, as you'll probably attest, great marker to look at overall insulin sensitivity, in addition to, postprandial changes in insulin, hemoglobin A1C, and glucose. So those are things that I think are very beneficial, and also expanded lipid panel. So if someone has a lot of small dense LDL particles or high particle number, that would suggest a low-grade insulin resistance going on in this metabolically obese normal weight phenomenon.
And so it sounds like a big mess, like a big fire. Everything's kind of feeding on one thing, right? You can't lose weight. You increase the leptin. That increases the inflammation. You maybe have autoimmunity, or, heaven forbid you have autoimmunity that affects your muscles or your joints. And then you don't feel well, and you don't have, you're in too much pain that you can't work out. So how does somebody get out of this boat? I mean, my head is swarming here thinking, oh my God, it's this cycle. How does the gerbil get off the wheel?
Yeah.
What is the starting point?
So I think the starting point is just making small, consistent steps, and first of all, regular exercise. And that can start out, I worked with individuals like you just had arthritis and, bad knees, achy knees and stuff. And so what we'd recommend for them, if they didn't have access to a gym, is just find a hill in their neighborhood and just walk up it once per day. That's all they could do. First thing in the morning, you're going to burn fat better first thing in the morning. And this is really important to, kind of take advantage of these circadian windows. So I know Dan talked about this a lot, and so these biological rhythms, and so we can exploit these. So first thing in the morning, take some green tea or coffee and go out and do some aerobic-based training. Again, wherever you are, just start doing something and be very consistent and regular with it. And the kind of barometer, you don't need a heart rate monitor or, pedometer. Just if you can't talk to your spouse while you're doing the exercise, you're doing a good thing, because we want to create this oxygen debt. That oxygen debt is going to stimulate adaptation inside the body, which will help you to better recover and work out harder the next time and build that lean muscle tissue and burn fat. The other thing is just starting out eating breakfast. I know this is like so simple, and people think that, people get busy, right?
After they've worked out.
After they work out. Yeah, okay. Really good point with that. And so a nice breakfast can be just grain-free paleo, eggs and vegetables. It sounds crazy, but just something very simple that you can eat. Even fish, nuts are really good first thing in the morning. And then eating a nice big lunch.
And I'll just back up, because some people listening to this on the autoimmune protocol, they don't eat eggs or nuts. So, some chicken or some grass-fed beef and vegetables, things like that.
That'd be really good too. Yeah, great point. Yeah, food sensitivities you have to look out for, because if you're eating a food that you're sensitive to, you're going to create inflammation. Inflammation creates insulin resistance. You can't burn fat if you're insulin resistant. So really great point right there. The other thing too, some people aren't big breakfast eaters, or they don't feel hungry. So, pea protein or whey protein shake is another good option with vegetables. And I know it's tempting for people, because it tastes a lot better, to put a banana and all this stuff in there, but just keep to the small berries, because the polyphenol to sugar ratio is a lot more favorable. And then going to lunch, that's where you can start to increase a little bit more carbs, because you're going to burn it off through the day. And just eat a nice big lunch. It's tempting. We tend to feel a lot better sometimes in the short term if we just skip lunch and just power through and have a shake or something. But your gut is really active during the middle part of the day. Digestive secretions, bile output, hydrochloric acid, motility. So that's really when you should be refueling, and that's going to help balance your leptin levels. So these are very simple things. And then while you're eating, we're getting down to the basics, but it's really powerful. Chew your food and be very present. So being mindful, this is something that I see even when I go to like IFM conferences, and people know all this stuff. They're just gobbling down food and not really being mindful. And again, how we introduce this topic, Dr. Amy is talking about how powerful the gut is and how it affects metabolism and immunity. We want to be mindful and chew our food to activate these gut hormones that will help us to process the foods that we eat better, help suppress our appetite, and improve blood sugar regulation.
Mm-hmm. And then in the evening time?
Evening time, I know there's the carb night thing going on right now around the internet. So that really applies. I
just heard about that yesterday. It's kind of interesting. Yeah. I was wondering how that played into all of this.
So the caveat to that is that's for really high-performing athletes and people that have a lot of lean muscle mass and are trying to really recover and rebuild and replenish glycogen. So that's that, 10 or 20% of the population that's really, they're doing the CrossFit. They don't have these belly fat issues. They're trying to bench press 500 pounds or squat 500 pounds. So there's some utility there. But I think for the general for most people, they're trying to optimize their health and cognition and productivity at work. you're going to do best just eating some lean protein and a lot of vegetables and some healthy fats at dinner. Because otherwise, I mean, let's face it, when you go to any restaurant in America, what are people eating mostly?
Carbs.
Pastas and breads. And we're doing the so-called carb night thing anyway, and it's not working for most people. So that's the caveat there. And I like what John Kiefer's doing. I think it's great, but I just want to provide that caveat.
Oh, I guess, is it spelled N-I-G-H-T? I was envisioning it to be spelled K-N-I-G-H-T, like a knight in shining armor. But now I get it's carbs like at night.
Right.
Anyway.
Yeah, it's funny.
Yeah. So what about that person, the original person that we were talking about, that person that's in my office or your office, they're really overweight, or maybe not even really overweight, but they're just, visibly overweight. They're making this conscious effort. They're really trying to do everything that you've mentioned. And, you're looking at their food diary and it's still, minuscule amounts of food and nothing's happening for them. I mean, is how that person jump starts different than what you just talked about, or is it the same?
It would be about the same. The other things that I would want to look at is maybe their toxicity burden. So what's going on? What's causing this fat tissue to really not be released? And look at the inflammatory load, and look at maybe expanded, not only C-reactive protein, but other, expanded maybe interleukins and different things, tissue oxidation, 8-OHDG in the organic acids. Like what's really going on here that's causing those issues? And then also, look at their sleep. Sleep is another big thing. So you just by having poor sleep hygiene. So it's not just that you get 8 hours every night. It's that you get to bed at the same time every night. And I talk about this in chapter 8 of belly fat effect and the whole circadian clock system. And when we go to bed at 2 a.m, then 10 a.m. and just start doing these changing our biological clock, we not only change our hormones, we not only change our appetite and satiety, but we affect our immune system. And again, the immune system and the metabolic system are so linked. And for people struggling with either weight loss resistance or autoimmunity, we need to look at that relationship. So I would look at sleep. And then also look at something like melatonin. If people are having sleep issues or sleep abnormalities, we'll definitely look at that as well. And I would look at stress. Stress is a huge thing, and I just have this here to remind me to talk about it. And I know you talk about this too, Dr. Myers, is heart math. And this is so critical, I found, for some of these people that, like you mentioned, they seem to be doing everything right from a dietary standpoint. And then you talk to them about their relationships or their work stress, and they have problems. Like they're taking care of, this was examples that come to mind. One individual was taking care of a spouse that had a disability. So just chronically stressed. And when you're stressed, you're going to screw up your gut hormones. You're going to drive cortisol and cause these abnormalities and really pivot your body to be a better fat storer instead of a better fat burner. So we all have stress. You're under stress. I'm under stress. We all are. And we need to find better ways to manage that. And for me, I found heart math to be the best because it gives me real-time feedback. When I sit there and try and meditate, I just think of all my to-dos. But with heart math, I get that real-time feedback and it beeps and it gets me into that calm parasympathetic state. And that's not only important for helping to balance my hormones, but when you're in that state, you actually kick on this anti-inflammatory signaling pathway via the vagal nerve, and that really helps to put the brakes on inflammation and raise those T regulatory cells, the policemen of the immune system. So not only are we less inflamed, but we can then start to burn fat better. So that's another thing I would look at is stress.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And what is your thought about like infrared saunas for those that can't, maybe are in too much pain or whatever, that are physically, they're not able to exercise? You have any thoughts about?
I think that's good. And just from the toxicity standpoint alone, we know that, glyphosate's in the air, it's in our water, it's in our food. There's toxins everywhere, household chemicals, cleaner products. So I think the sauna would be great if you can afford it. I think everyone should be doing that regardless, that would be good. But I think even if you do have arthritis and psoriatic arthritis or weight-related issues that are causing musculoskeletal dysfunction and you can't move, I think it's important just to even do sit-ups, just some sort of movement, because there's a trigger of inflammation, and that's hypoxia or low levels of oxygen. And this has been well described. And so the more fat you have, the more hypoxia, or the lower the level of oxygen is around that fat tissue. And that triggers this cellular signaling molecule called hypoxia-inducible factor 1 alpha, and it gets a little complex. But if you're just sitting around stagnant and eating all the right stuff and you're balancing your stress and you're sleeping, you're going to be inflamed. So we can't ignore movement. And for like the patient that you mentioned that has all these challenges, get into a pool, for example, so that you can do like, low weight bearing movement on an elliptical, for example. That's really smooth. You can do that. Just most people can walk, or if you can't even do that, then I would suggest sit-ups and core-based like Pilates type movement, because we need to increase blood flow to our gut and the rest of the body.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I was going to ask you something else. Oh, people, many people with autoimmunity, and it's something that we have a whole a talk on here throughout the summit, and I have a part of my book talks about adrenal fatigue. So you mentioned exercising first thing in the morning. So what about the person who, is so tired, they're going to bed on time, but they still need that, 10, 11 hours worth of sleep. And so, they're basically only able to get up, in time to get them to work. So what's your recommendation then? Exercise at some point is better than no exercise. What do you recommend?
Yeah, really great point. Yeah, I mean, some days we sleep in, we get tired. I totally understand that. We have to go to an airplane or a meeting or whatever. Totally get it. I would suggest then exercising right before lunch. So get your smoothie, just get something in your body. So, something is better than nothing when it comes to breakfast. No kidding. And so protein obviously would be preferable, but then, get through your morning and then do some exercise right before lunch. So the whole point on that is getting back to the circadian clock system. We tend to burn fat at night and in the morning, and then tend to burn more and more sugar throughout the day. And you get actually more insulin resistant as the day goes on. So that's why it's important to get your carbohydrates in the morning and at lunchtime. So back to that client or patient or person, definitely just right before lunch, because you're going to still be in that window where you can burn fat. And then if you can have a little bit of coffee, that won't keep you up later at night, or green tea, that'll help you to what they call increased lipolysis, or the breaking up of fat tissue, help you burn fat better. So that would be my advice there.
And with the coffee or the tea, does that need to be caffeinated, or does decaf do the same thing?
Yeah, I know. So yeah, caffeine actually, I know it's kind of taboo in our functional medicine realm, but in the context of increasing lipolysis and burning fat, caffeine is our friend. So I do encourage that, not to depend on it, but for people that are struggling to kickstart weight loss and to because it really, when you can start to see results, it's kind of, you can increase like a vicious cycle in a good way, self-perpetuating cycle. And so I think it's nice to give people some of that instant gratification, like, oh my gosh, these pants that I haven't been able to wear in the last 10 years, that they fit now. So that's why I like to encourage, some use of caffeine to kind of kickstart the cycle, get people feeling better and get results quicker.
And then in terms of exercise, are you one that believes more in interval training, weight training? Doesn't really matter, just get out and do something?
Yeah, I both and all. So get out and do something. But I think, telling people to do weights and aerobics and HIIT training if they haven't even started walking is going to be too much and scare them away. So I think baby steps and slowly getting there. But in an ideal world, for a healthy person, I would suggest a 5-day-a-week exercise program. You're doing a weight training, and when I say weight training, it's intense. You're failing at rep 8 or 10. It's really hard and really intense, and this can be any age range. From grandmothers to teenagers. Weight training is so important. I have a friend who's a naturopathic doctor, and his father got into CrossFit, and he's 60 years old, and he's in phenomenal shape, better shape than most 40-year-olds that I know. So this can happen at any point in time, and the important part about it is just to do more compound-based movement. So, stay away from the machines and so forth. Just stick to free weights and dumbbells and barbells and so forth. And then the cardiovascular part, if weight loss is your goal, I would suggest that, like we talked about, in the morning, or if you can't do that after your 4-day-a-week full body split, then you can do cardio afterwards. And then one day can be a longer duration cardio, like hiking, getting out to the beach with your children or your dog, and just really kind of increasing the aerobic system. That can be on a Friday or Saturday on the weekend, and trying to get like 60 minutes of some, get your heart rate up and really get your aerobic system tuned.
Sounds good. So I think we touched on it, but I just thought maybe we could go back and do it all in one conversation so people get a sense, just about the leptin, increasing the inflammation, and then how that really relates to autoimmunity.
Love that. Yeah. So, as we mentioned, leptin is released from fat tissue. It not only affects appetite and satiety, but what it does is it actually drives inflammation. So, when we think of like cortisol, that's kind of like a stress hormone, right? And these other hormones kind of just have one function, but leptin has these two different personalities: the appetite control and also the inflammation signaling. And it's triggered by inflammatory events, and it's also inflammatory by its own kind of default. And why is this important? Well, leptin has been linked with higher mortality from breast cancer, more metastatic breast cancer, Hashimoto's, rheumatoid arthritis, psoriatic arthritis, asthma, allergy, atopy, pretty much every chronic inflammatory you can think of. There's a study out there in a reputable journal that has shown or correlated leptin with greater inflammatory incidence. So it's one of these things that we definitely need to consider and look at. And I think it's at the core of the induction of inflammatory diseases. And we can even look at, for example, how does leptin become resistant? There are studies showing that intestinal permeability is actually one of the key signaling pathways that induce leptin resistance through a complex mechanism. So what can we do about that? We can increase the amount of anti-inflammatory foods in our diet. So you don't need to be a biochemist, just eat foods with color. So curcumin, blueberries, raspberries, small amounts of red wine, green tea. Anything with a color is going to have a structure called a polyphenol. And those polyphenols speak to our body, speak to our cells, and reduce the inflammatory signaling, and they also help leptin signaling as well. Curcumin has been shown to be very beneficial for leptin resistance and also restoring inflammation, so that's one thing. The other thing, there's a new compound called oral bisque. It's a hyaluronic acid-based ingredient. It's a dietary supplement that's been shown to help improve leptin signaling, downregulate insulin resistance, and in so doing, downregulate inflammation. So those are some things that we can recommend for folks.
Awesome. And in your book, is it a program, or, tell us about your book. Is it just walks you through a lot of what you said and it's more explaining it to you, or do you have a program associated with it as well?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So the book goes through all these different components, really starting at the gut, and then I talk people through, all the science, but break it down so anyone from, again, like someone like my mother to, medical professional can really take away some key points here. And at the end of each chapter, I have explanations and, key takeaways or to-dos. So I think everyone's individual. I, kind of get some critique for not creating a system, but I just like to give people the tips, so in the topic on circadian clocks, like here's what you should do. If you can't sleep, here's melatonin, here's the science, etc. When I talk about, how to increase fat burning from a good healthy diet, here's what a good healthy diet looks like. Here's how this healthy diet improves your gut microbiome and helps you to burn fat. Here's some foods I recommend. So you can kind of pick and choose what you want or how you want to apply it to your life. But I don't think there's really a one size fits all, because everyone's at different levels, and I didn't want to exclude too many people. I just wanted to give people the information and then extrapolate what they want from the key takeaways.
Awesome. Well, great. Well, I definitely found this super informative. Is there anything before we part ways in terms of that you feel like we didn't have a chance to hit on regarding leptin, inflammation, autoimmunity?
I would just say, the one thing that the biggest tool I would say, Dr. Myers, is heart math. I found that to be so effective for people. Stress and environmental toxins are things we really can't get away from. So just practice your stress reduction-based therapies and just shop local, buy local, avoid GMO foods at all costs, because those are going to trash your gut and that's going to affect your ability to burn fat. And for folks that want to learn more about that, I have a free video series at bellyfateffect.com. People can opt in, and it's 3 different webinar series that dive into what we talked about in a little more depth, and if people want, they can download them or listen to it on their MP3. So
great. And is that the best website for people to get in touch with you as well, or do you have a...
Yeah, my main website, Mike Mutzel, and Mutzel is MUTZEL.com, and people can opt in there too, and I have a lot of articles and blog posts and stuff like that on this topic. So